Hi, my name is Marlo Hood. Welcome to a new edition of the AFP Foundation's training course for journalists on climate change and sustainable development. In 1992, at the Earth Summit in Rio, the world's nations finalized the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Its declared aim was, and I quote, the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. In plain English, it sought to keep the planet from overheating. But this historic agreement didn't say how to get the job done or on what time frame. 2 decades later, ahead of the Rio +20 summit, the esteemed science journal Nature published a report card on the UNFCCC's progress in accomplishing its core task. The grade was an F for failure. This segment will trace the history of UN climate change negotiations to see what went wrong and how they just might, in the end, get a passing mark. Humanity's collective effort to save itself from a climate system run amok began with science. Already in the 19th century, a Swedish physicist trying to understand what caused ice ages unlocked the relationship between the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere and the fluctuations of Earth's temperature on a geological timescale. Svante Arrhenius calculated that reducing by half the amount of CO2 would plunge the planet into a deep freeze, and that doubling it would boost temperatures by about 5 degrees Celsius. He was remarkably close to the mark, except on one point. He thought it would take at least 1,000 years for such a change to occur. At the current rate of greenhouse gas emissions, it will only take 100. Arrhenius' work was brilliant, but speculative. It wasn't until the second half of the 20th century that scientists began to take the measurements that could confirm his hypothesis. And it wasn't until the 1980s that politicians began to act on it. An important milestone was the 1988 testimony in the U.S. House of Representatives by a government scientist named James Hansen. The headline the next day was startling: Global warming has begun. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC for short, a network of several thousand scientists collaborating on a voluntary basis, was created that same year to provide guidance to world leaders and policymakers on what, if anything, could and should be done. Their work, collated every 4 or 5 years in a phone book-sized report, has remained the scientific benchmark for political action. The IPCC's first assessment, published in 1990, was tentative and riddled with uncertainties. Still, it concluded that the planet was getting warmer and that CO2 was responsible for at least half of what it described as an enhanced greenhouse effect. It also said human activities had substantially added to the atmosphere's store of heat-trapping gases. The community of nations decided to act, resulting in the UN Convention on Climate Change. But from the very beginning, the effort was pulled in 2 opposite directions: towards a centralized, top-down approach and a bottom-up effort in which each nation would pitch in what it could. It was a tension that was to hobble the UN Forum for the next 20 years. In 1992, it was widely assumed that any agreement emerging from the UN-sponsored negotiations would take the form of a legally binding treaty, including penalties for failure to comply, to which nations could and would adhere. There was, in fact, a recent and shining example of how that might work. Only a few years earlier, 196 nations had banded together to beat back another environmental threat to human well-being: the depletion of atmospheric ozone. Several kinds of aerosol chemicals used in manufacturing, scientists had discovered, were tearing a hole in the thin layer of ozone in the stratosphere that protects us from the sun's dangerous and cancer-causing ultraviolet rays. The Montreal Protocol, which entered into force in 1989, required the phasing out of these chemicals. The ozone layer today is on the mend and the treaty is hailed as a model of international cooperation. So why not manage greenhouse gases in the same way? The proposed climate convention laid the foundation and was set to go even further. But outgoing U.S. President George H.W. Bush made it clear that the U.S. would not sign or ratify any document that spelled out binding commitments on emissions reductions or money for the developing world. And that's the way it went. At the same time, however, Washington did recognize a bedrock principle in the convention, that nations share, and I quote, common but differentiated responsibility, close quote, for global warming. That key phrase, which girds and bedevils climate talks to this day, meant that highly industrialized countries, Europe, the United States, Japan, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, acknowledged historical responsibility for spewing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and that they should therefore do more to repair the damage. Rich nations and developing ones, in other words, were in two different categories. In signing the convention, the U.S. and other rich nations also agreed to help poor and vulnerable states prepare for future climate change. These then were the twin pillars of the new regime: mitigation and adaptation. Almost immediately, however, it became apparent that global warming was worse than once thought and that a voluntary approach was not working. Global emissions of carbon dioxide continued to climb, increasing on average by a couple of percentage points each year from the convention's 1990 baseline of nearly 23 billion tons. The IPCC, meanwhile, the scientific body, had issued its second report, highlighting the urgency more clearly than ever. Thus was born the Kyoto Protocol, negotiated in 1995, adopted in 1997, and put into force in 2005. The treaty, for that's what it was, mandated that some 36 wealthy nations would each reduce a basket of 6 greenhouse gases such that each country's emissions would go down by a certain percentage over time. Collectively, the effort was to trim the total, compared to the 1990 benchmark, by 5% before 2012. The United States pushed hard for the protocol to be accepted. We have reached a fundamental new stage in the development of human civilization in which it is necessary to take responsibility for a recent but profound alteration in the relationship between our species and our planet, Vice President Al Gore told delegates in Kyoto in December 1997. I commit to you today that the United States is prepared to act and will act. The treaty was adopted and champagne flowed. But then, in a move that crippled the initiative from the outset, Washington failed to ratify it. In a 95-0 vote, the U.S. Senate made it clear that the United States would never sign a deal unless all the world's major carbon polluters, including China, India, and other emerging economies, were also under obligation. The Clinton administration never even took it to Congress for a vote. The Kyoto Protocol limped along through its first commitment period, which ran from 2008 through 2012. Russia had finally joined it, but when it came time to negotiate a second commitment period running through 2020, several other nations dropped out. In the end, Kyoto's fatal flaw was that it only covered about 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. It simply wasn't going to get the job done. Even if the Kyoto Protocol has slowly withered into irrelevance, its legacy may yet prove useful. Because of its binding nature, for example, it forced nations to set up a system for monitoring, reporting, and verifying the emissions reductions pledges made by rich nations. These tools, while incomplete, provide a blueprint for the future. Kyoto also pioneered a market-based mechanism for trading carbon emissions credits, paving the way for efforts such as the cap-and-trade European Union emissions trading system. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. By 2006, it became clear that Kyoto was not going to be the vehicle for humanity's salvation. Besides the U.S. withdrawal, China was clearly on track to become the largest carbon polluter on the planet, and India wasn't too far behind. And so the focus of the UN climate negotiations shifted to the question of how to forge a broader framework that would include all the world's major carbon polluters. But momentum in the talks, entering their second decade, still pushed in the direction of a top-down, legally binding treaty. This set the stage for the Climate Summit of 2009 in Copenhagen, which has already gone down in history as a diplomatic fiasco. Some 115 heads of government and state showed up at the end of the Conference of the Parties that was supposed to save the planet in order to sign a deal and take a group picture while raising their glasses in victory. Instead, they had to cobble together a 3-page, 11th-hour, face-saving document that came to be known as the Copenhagen Accord. COP15, in climate talks lingo, was widely described as a failure. But amid the rubble of the collapsed talks were the building blocks for another approach and another deal, one that could emerge in December 2015. The road from Copenhagen to Paris is the next chapter in our story. To better understand the background of the UN negotiations on climate change, we spoke to Alden Meyer, who is a scientist and climate analyst at the Union for Concerned Scientists based in Washington. Here's what he had to say.
Well, it really came onto the agenda after the first IPCC report in the late 1980s, and the General Assembly decided to launch a negotiation process towards what became the Rio Treaty that was adopted at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit in Brazil. And that was the beginning of this regime that was ratified and entered into force by 1995, which was the first Conference of the Parties meeting in Berlin. And a little remembered fact is that the president of COP1 was current Chancellor Angela Merkel. She was the environment minister of Germany at the time. So her involvement in this process goes back 20 years as well.
I think we have enough perspective perhaps now on the Kyoto Protocol to make an assessment of over the long haul. What is your judgment on the Kyoto Protocol?
I think Kyoto was effective in showing how you would develop the rules and the architecture, what's come to be called the MRV, monitoring and reporting and verification, which is now a core part of these Paris negotiations, how you would track emissions and how you would develop a set of national inventories and communications so that countries would report on how they were doing nationally, periodically. That was all very good. Of course, Kyoto also established emissions trading regime and the clean development mechanism as well as joint implementation. So the concept of market-based mechanisms was introduced to the world, and these were based on what had been done in the United States with sulfur dioxide in the 1980s and early 1990s. So that was an innovation that was part of Kyoto. But I think once you had Japan, Russia, and others pull out of the second commitment period, you had somewhere around 15% of the world's emissions obligated under Kyoto, meaning 85% wasn't. And that's when it became very clear that we needed something new to replace the Kyoto framework.
Common but differentiated responsibilities. Can you explain to us what this principle is and how it's evolved?
Well, the principle, which I think is still relevant, was meant to imply that everyone has to do something on this problem. It's a common problem, it's a common threat, and everybody has the capability to do something. But it's differentiated in the sense that those with the most historical responsibility and those with the most capacity to act have a greater responsibility than others. So the responsibility of the United States, which is the world's largest historical committer and obviously the world's largest economy and with tremendous technical capability, has a greater responsibility to act than Bangladesh or Chad or even New Zealand and other industrialized countries. That was clear. I think where it's become a bit of a flashpoint in the negotiations is you've got one set of countries which tends to say that we need to freeze in place the definition of who has to do what as it was back in 1992, so that developed countries have to take mandatory emissions reduction action, and developing countries only need to take action on a voluntary basis supported by funding and technology from developed countries. That's a very static view of the world. And actually, it wasn't even fully fair back in 1992 because you had some very wealthy countries like the Gulf oil countries that had tremendous wealth and capability and yet were treated just the same as Chad or Bangladesh. So from the beginning, dividing the world into two static camps hasn't made a lot of sense. I think if you can use it as a guideline or a principle for an evolving regime that still is differentiated but is not frozen in time and hopefully has some objectively agreed criteria about who is expected to do what, it's still a very relevant principle. But of course that issue of deciding who is expected to do what is very fraught with political and ideological pitfalls.
So today we looked at the history of the climate talks within the UN framework. So here are a few tips for journalists. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is the bedrock for more than 20 years of negotiations that have happened since then. So take the time to read it. Tip number 2. Don't get lost in the impenetrable jargon and bureaucratic detail of the UN climate process. Detail is, of course, important, but so is the big picture. When you're sitting down to write a story or you're trying to craft a lead, for example, imagine that you're talking to somebody that you just met in an airport or on a train who knows that global warming is a problem but doesn't know much more than that. That's your audience. Tip number 3. When covering the policy side of climate change, and especially the UN negotiations, sometimes a very small detail can have a very large significance. So don't be shy about asking experts who have been following this process, some of them for more than 2 decades. If you're not sure about something, find somebody who is. And finally, last tip, one of the interesting dimensions of this story is the relationship between science and policy and how those two things have nurtured each other throughout this process. Don't forget that story and look for ways to illustrate it. So here are a few essential points to retain from this session. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, is the foundation for all the various strands within the climate change negotiations over the last 2 decades. Second point, more than 20 years of climate talks have been pulled in 2 directions. One towards binding, top-down commitments that could be enshrined in a treaty, as was the case with the Kyoto Protocol, and bottom-up initiatives grounded in the voluntary efforts made by individual countries. Number 3, the Kyoto Protocol was hampered from the beginning by the non-ratification of the US, but in any case, the climate talks would have had to broaden to include emerging economies that have joined the ranks of the world's largest carbon emitters, especially China and India. And finally, both the Kyoto Protocol and the Copenhagen Summit have been described as failures, but both contained important silver linings that will help build future agreements and progress on fighting climate change.